Thanks for joining us. This is Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Last year, businesses faced various problems following the pandemic. This includes shortage of workers, shipping rates going through the roof, and enforced shutdowns to lockdowns. And of course, we're talking about the biggest problem of them all that we're still going through right now, which is supply chain disruption. And when we talk about different sectors and different industries, be it in the semiconductor industry or the retail industry or the electronics industry, whatever, the global supply chain facing tremendous pressures to a point where companies do cut corners, and sometimes they even break the law, particularly when we talk about companies that are going to go through some issues of worker shortages and the like. So because of this, we're trying to understand how to, number one, address the bigger problem of trying to ensure that companies comply with the laws. But more importantly, the second one is try to help companies be more productive and profitable and sustainable. And the most important thing here is to be an ethical kind of company. So there's a lot of conversations that needs to be unpacked in this evening. So joining me is Peter van Veen. He is the Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England in England and Wales, ICAEW. Peter joins us from the United Kingdom. Peter, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. I want to talk to you about some ideas resulting in this whole notion that we just outlaid just now about supply chain due diligence, for instance, and supply chain sustainability. Let's talk about the importance of it and perhaps why we need to think about how companies can actually embrace this importance into how they operate.
Well, I think there are a number of dimensions here. One is the most obvious in terms of if you're a long way away from Europe or US, is that there is more and more regulations coming in, more and more laws that are forcing customers in the West to do this kind of work. But I think it's important just to go rewind a little bit and say, well, why are these laws coming in, and why is there so much pressure to do more and more due diligence on supply chains? And I think it's largely a driver through there is a large and growing awareness of supply chain issues, and a growing awareness that really an expectation, I should say, that companies need to take responsibility for their supply chains, and they cannot just outsource the risks, and they cannot wash their hands, if you like, of issues further down the supply chain. So in practical terms, what does that mean? In a number of industries, there's been a long-running trend to de-risk, to spin off or get rid of parts of their own business that are deemed very risky. What you can see it in the oil industry, where exploration production in high-risk countries, and by high risk I mean countries that have political instability, are deemed very corrupt. Very few, if any, I would say none, of the large major oil companies are still prepared to put their own people and do their own exploration production there. There'll be smaller companies who'll do that, and they'll contract it out, and even the production and exploration, all of that will be outsourced, if you like, pushed further and further away from the company. And I think there's now a reaction. There's a reaction. I wouldn't say specifically in the oil industry, but in other industries, where one could say the dirtier part of the industry, or the parts of that industry that are known to have issues around employment rights or using child labor, pushing it away and saying, well, it's got nothing to do with us, is just not good enough anymore. And I think that's really what this is about. It's just saying, well, look, even if you outsource your production, even if they're not your employees, you still have responsibility. And that degree of responsibility, of course, is what those laws are trying to define.
In Malaysia, as well as in many other countries, the small and medium-sized enterprises do form the bulk of the corporate world. In Malaysia, some estimates put between 60, some estimates say 97%. Whatever it is the majority of businesses here. How do you feel oversight being seen in the SME sector? Do you feel that it's severely lacking for companies, especially in the SME sector, largely because they have other stuff to do in terms of trying to find revenue, in terms of reducing cost? Therefore, oversight, regulatory, corporate governance might not necessarily be the big thing for these kind of size of companies.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very difficult being an SME because one, how on earth do you stay on top of all the requirements of your customers further up the supply chain in all these different countries, who are all under pressure to report on all sorts of metrics. So as an SME, you're producing whatever it is you're producing, and you're trying to do a good product and provide for your family and so forth. You're not lawyers, and you're not accountants hoping to be able to provide all this extra information as well. So it's a difficult situation, but also the challenge, and this is it's how close are you to your end customer? How much dialogue do you have with them? Because it is really incumbent on on those larger customers to also provide training, support, and look after their supply chain, especially the SME customers. And I've certainly seen that in the food and beverage industry, where, for example, there is a global FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods initiative called AIM Progress, based in Brussels, where it's very much about employment, looking after employees, and around living wage, and that whole industry is working with supply chains in a lot of countries to inform and train and raise awareness and raise standards throughout the supply chain to kind of really make an impact in terms of ensuring everyone's properly paid and so forth. So there are those industry initiatives they exist. They are doing interesting work, but of course you have to be within their radar to benefit. And so how do you benefit if you're not part of that kind of ecosystem? Or how do you even deal with some of those challenges? It's very difficult.
We need to look at how companies can restructure, right? Because we need to move away from the dependency on globalized supply chain, perhaps think about regional supply chain maybe. We need to also talk about how manufacturing is moving away from China post-COVID, and many countries and regions are now developing manufacturing mega hubs and mega centers themselves. And how do we shorten the supply chain issue because of the huge cost and commitment burdens of these kind of companies, especially suppliers, in terms of executing the order deals that they have? Do you feel that the restructuring trend is very critical right now for us?
Well, I mean, I think yes is the answer. I think there are shortening supply. I think COVID already put a lot of pressure on companies to try and move things closer to home, just for very practical reasons. In that, when China locked down parts of the country, and certainly in what we saw in Europe, is that critical parts, critical products, and even non-critical products were becoming more and more difficult to get hold of, because they just weren't being manufactured, or they're stuck in warehouses. So there is some, but there's only a limit to how much you can nearshore, if you like, how much you can bring closer to, because let's not underestimate the size, of course, of the manufacturing base in China, and you can't just replicate that everywhere. So one has to be selective. But what we are also seeing, of course, is that with what's happening in Russia, is that there is now a real fear of that supply chains will be disrupted longer term through conflict and through security considerations, where you might be in the supply chain, and all of a sudden find that the people you're doing business with are now part of a sanctions regime, and you can't actually trade with them anymore. That can happen very, very quickly. In fact, it can happen overnight, as it did with Russia a few months ago. And so really, that situation really becomes critical. So for companies to shorten the supply chain and have more visibility is critical so that they can manage those risks. But if you're in that supply chain, you also want to be a bit closer to your customer, so you cannot become isolated by accident, as some companies have become, because the intermediaries between them and their customer are on a sanctioned list or are for logistical reasons kind of unable to provide move those products onto the customer, and we're seeing a bit of that. So there's a bit of replanning and reorganization of some supply chains to make them shorter and therefore easier for the customers to get what they need quickly and without relying on these very long or complicated supply chains, which certainly were the norm only a couple of years ago.
Okay, we'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more with Peter van Veen of ICAEW. Thanks for staying on with me. I have on the line Peter van Veen joining us from the UK. He is the Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at ICAEW, or the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Peter, let's talk about due diligence. We all know that legislation differs from country to country. Directors need to have the necessary tools to assure the stakeholders and shareholders of the viable reporting techniques and sustainability aspect of it. Not ESG per se, but how they can be reported on a timely manner. There are various reporting financial standards that is afflicting many countries. One country may have different financial reporting standards compared to another. And how do you harmonize the kind of reporting standards to a point where everybody, all the stakeholders can read the same report and understand exactly what it means? Because of these elements of changes between jurisdictions to jurisdictions, country to country, markets to markets, how do you feel that due diligence can be better done and, more importantly, better understood by most stakeholders, if not all stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it's become a whole industry in its own right, due diligence on third parties, and there are a number of data providers who aggregate all this stuff, and quite a few others who are providing tools who draw into that data, and these are available to anyone, and most often than not, it's public data. The challenge with the public data, including of course in Malaysia, in terms of whether a company is debarred or whether it's being prosecuted or information like that, it's available, but unless you are an expert as to where to look and what in what kind of government websites this information is available, it's hard work to collate this yourself. So those third parties who collate this information are really doing that essential function. And it allows you, when you enter a company into the database, I mean, the most basic one, which I've used in the past when I was a chief compliance officer, was something called World Check. And I'm not here to promote anyone's platform, by the way. So I mean, there are a dozen or so alternatives available. But you would fill in the company's details, and this is one of the more basic tools, and it would then throw up whether that company has any and the recent history of any prosecutions, whether it's received any fines and what for, and whether any of its directors, there's a red flag on any of the directors, whether they're on the sanctions list, whether the company appears on the sanctions list. So very basic information, but quite important. That, however, will not give you a fully adequate picture, because it will only tell you when someone's already been convicted or fined. It will not tell you whether someone's under suspicion, whether an entity is, in the press repeatedly for allegations. It won't tell you necessarily that, although there are, and those kind of tools are the more sophisticated tools aggregate that information as well, so you can kind of build a profile of the parties that you're doing business with. And this could also be your customers, by the way. It does not just have to be your suppliers. You can also check out whether your customers are appearing on sanctions list, whether they are a reliable party to continue doing trading with, or whether you need to start looking for alternatives. That kind of thing are, those tools are available off the shelf. But ultimately, they're only going to go as far as the public information that's available. I have seen tools that go much further than that, but I think then you start getting into questions around how ethical is it. For example, in fact, one of the tools I had a demo from went in and actually did social media searches on the individuals and built profiles of them and their families. And I think that goes a bit too far. I mean, do you really need that level of detail? Probably not. But there will be incidences, and this is much more in the M&A space, the mergers and acquisition space, where you might want to go a bit further, where you might want to get boots on the ground to go and interview people in the industry and try and build a bit of a profile of the reputation of the firm and whether everything is as it appears. But for most normal day-to-day transactions, the basic or a slightly enhanced kind of data around how they trade, what their trading history is like, on whether there's any credit risk or whether they appear on a sanctions list or on some kind of other legal kind of database. That's probably sufficient for most parties. And as I said, this information, those products are readily available. It's not there's no restriction on getting access to these things. Of course, there's a cost involved.
Okay. Let's go for one more short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more with Peter van Veen of ICAEW. Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me on the line via video call is Peter van Veen of ICAEW. Peter, let's talk a little bit more about costs and benefit, because on top of talking about all this, we need to understand the first notion. If the company doesn't want to do it, then nothing will move. Do you feel that there is a business case for companies to actually adopt a greater amount of control on corporate governance and due diligence? What is the profitability argument when it comes to companies embracing good governance and good accountability and good sustainability practices?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think that's right. So I mean, absolutely, with this increase in regulation, increase in due diligence requirements, there is definitely a cost element. I mean, there's no way around that. It costs more to do business. Even on the most basic level, I've seen, the burden just to fill in the forms of customers in terms of to provide all the data they require to be able to even just complete a transaction with them. I mean, this can take a couple of days. I mean, this is a real cost aspect, and I have heard of SMEs turning down business not because they want to turn it down, but because they cannot comply with the data provision requirements. So there's definitely a cost benefit debate there. But I think there's also, as you say, it can be an aspect of competitive advantage if you can provide it, if you can present the right data in the right format easily, then you can jump to the front of the queue when it comes to doing business with a whole host of companies. I remember I was in Malaysia many moons ago for when I worked in a different organization, and we were discussing the impact of the UK Bribery Act on Malaysian business in terms of supply chains, in terms of supplying too. And one of the things that I learned was that there was a British standard at the time, and this is, I'm afraid this is a little bit nerdy, but it really is a standard to demonstrate that you had anti-corruption management practices in place. It's as simple as that. I think BS 1493, something like that. And I was surprised to learn that it was actually quite popular amongst a number of industries in Malaysia to get certified by the standard. And I thought, why would you get certified to this British standard about a British piece of legislation in Malaysia? And the answer is very simple. It was competitive advantage. If they can show this and demonstrate these good systems, it would make life a lot easier and make it much easier to do business with UK companies. And that was the lesson there. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone run out and get ISO certified on all these various things, but these are genuine considerations. How can you demonstrate that you are not just compliant, but you are, ahead of the minimum, and those international standards tend to be a good way of doing that, but there are other ways as well, and it does provide competitive advantage, because those larger companies, they've got a real headache. How on earth do they really ensure that the supply chain are indeed compliant? Because there is a lot of greenwashing going around by all. And greenwashing, for your listeners, is really where you are pretending to be much better at things than you actually are when it comes to environment or social metrics. And so there's a lot of inflation of these kind of metrics going on. So anything that is certifiable, anything that stands up to scrutiny, that you can easily present to your customers is going to really help and potentially be of real competitive advantage.
Finally, I want to ask you about the expectations of other key holders and other stakeholders in the realm of trading and trading chain, especially when we talk about financiers, banks, financial institutions, investors, and the likes. Do you feel that SMEs can leverage on their position in a sustainably resilient supply chain manner to use, say for instance, other forms of financing like blockchain financing and many others? Do you feel that the stakeholders do come to expect some form of standards when it comes to sustainability from companies big and small? What are some of the ideas that you can talk to us when it comes to stakeholder management in the realm of sustainability and good governance?
Yeah, so I mean, financial institutions are by default very risk averse. I mean, this is their business, right? To manage risk and to and I don't know many banks who are going to be who are going to throw caution to the wind. So they're very risk averse. There's a lot of pressure also on them to ensure they have their ESG metrics in order, that they're reporting on things adequately. But more and more, and this is a more recent trend, investors in bank have started to put a lot of pressure on banks if they are making statements about their own business, but at the same time are funding things that are counter in terms of their own values and so forth. So there is this really difficult situations where banks are now starting to be very critical on things like coal, where they're no longer funding it because it doesn't fit the messaging they're putting out. They're not willing to be associated with something that has such a negative image, and so that's a real challenge, and I know one of the larger banks in Malaysia 5-6 years ago had a similar issue when it came to palm oil. They were under a lot of pressure by environmental groups on their funding of the palm oil industry, and in particular a couple of companies that had been in the spotlight for potentially illegally illegal kind of growing of palm tree in national forests and so forth. So it's very difficult for those banks to give assurance and give clarity on the impact on their customers' work. So for them, it's even more challenging in some ways to keep an eye on all their customers and to give that kind of assurance that everything is in order from an ESG perspective. So there is a lot of pressure around that, but it does make it more difficult for SMEs to get access to finance if you're in certain industries. I mean, that's absolutely the case. We've seen it in a number of industries already. I mean, in the UK, it's a ridiculous example, but one of the larger banks, when they were under investigation, in fact, they were convicted for not having sufficient AML controls in place, de-risked and wrote to all the charities or all the charities involving certain types of activities that they had to give up their bank accounts. And there was a scandal that they'd written to quite a few Muslim associations that they were no longer prepared to provide banking services. And the only reason for that was that the certain keywords had appeared on and they weren't prepared to do that. So it has all these unintended consequences. That was all corrected in the end, and so forth. But it can have. But if you're a small company, how do you you're likely to not have a lot of clout and a lot of power to deal with when you're on the wrong side of one of those big exercises to de-risk in the financial system. If you're a large company or if you're a charity and the media pick it up, then you have a chance. But if you're an SME in an industry that doesn't make the news very often, it's really very difficult. And I'm very sympathetic to that challenge. But I think the biggest leverage SMEs can have is through collective action, either through an industry body, through professional bodies like ourselves, through the finance function. There are ways that SMEs can have more clout through really grouping together and trying to make change and trying to kind of act more collectively in that way.
Thank you very much. That was Peter van Veen, the Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. If you've missed any part of this interview, just log on to astro.com and look for these kind of interviews and these kind of conversations there. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.